The garage door hadn't been opened in almost a year. David Reyes stood in front of it with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, looking at the dust on the handle like it was a dare. 41 years old, divorced for 2 of them, and somehow the garage had become the one room in the house he just kept avoiding. Boxes, tools, things that used to belong to a life that had 2 names on the mailbox instead of 1. It was a Saturday morning in late October. The kind of gray, quiet morning where the whole street seemed to be holding its breath. Somewhere a dog barked twice and stopped. The air smelled like wet leaves and the neighbor's fireplace. David finally pushed the door up. It groaned on its tracks, metal complaining after months of silence, and a thin sheet of cold air rolled out to meet him. He stepped inside. It looked exactly the way he remembered. Worse, maybe. A bike with 2 flat tires leaning in the corner. A shelf of paint cans that had probably dried into solid bricks by now. A box marked kitchen stuff that he was fairly sure actually had Christmas decorations in it, because nothing in his life had been labeled correctly since the divorce. He wasn't doing this because he wanted to. His sister had called him 3 times this week asking when he was finally going to deal with the garage, like it was a wound that needed stitches. So here he was, dealing with it. He worked for almost an hour without thinking much, folding flattened boxes, setting aside things to donate. There's a strange kind of peace in physical work when your mind has been loud for too long. It gives your hands something to do so your thoughts can finally quiet down a little. It was in the back corner, behind a stack of old paint cans, that he found the metal toolbox. He didn't recognize it. It wasn't his father's. He knew his father's toolbox, the dented red one that was now in his own garage back in Ohio. This one was different, smaller, steel, painted a faded green, the kind of toolbox you'd see in a hardware store decades ago. There was a thin layer of rust creeping along one corner, like it had sat untouched through more winters than he could count. He crouched down and pulled it toward him. It was heavier than it looked. When he flipped the latch, it didn't open right away. It took some convincing, some patience, a little WD-40 he had stashed in his back pocket from earlier. Finally, with a small metallic groan, it gave. Inside, there were no tools. Instead, there was a single brass key sitting in the middle of the folded cloth, like someone had placed it there deliberately, almost ceremonially. The key was old, not antique old, but old enough that its edges had been smoothed by handling. And taped to the cloth beneath, it was a small paper tag. David picked it up and turned it toward the light from the open garage door. Written on the tag, in handwriting that wasn't his ex-wife's, wasn't anyone he immediately recognized, was his own name. David Reyes. He stood there for a long moment, the key resting in his palm, feeling the strange chill that comes from realizing something doesn't add up. He hadn't put this here. His ex-wife hadn't lived in this house long enough to plant something like this. And as far as he knew, no one else had access to this garage in the 11 years he'd owned the place. So who had written his name on a tag, hidden inside a toolbox, in the back corner of his own garage? He turned the key over once more. There was no address, no explanation, just a key and his name, and a question that wouldn't let him go back to folding boxes like nothing had happened. David didn't sleep well that night. He kept the key on his nightstand, which felt strange even as he did it, like keeping a stranger's secret in his bedroom. He turned it over in his fingers more times than he wanted to admit, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak the way old houses do when the temperature drops. He thought about calling his sister. He decided against it. She'd probably tell him to throw it away, or worse. She'd get too curious and show up at his door wanting to investigate with him, turning a quiet personal mystery into a weekend project with snacks involved. Instead, in the morning, he did what any reasonably curious person would do. He looked at the key more closely. It wasn't a house key, too small, too delicate for a deadbolt or a doorknob. It looked more like the kind of key that opens something smaller. A drawer, a cabinet, a safety deposit box, maybe. That thought stuck with him through his coffee, through his shower, through the slow, Sunday quiet of the man who didn't have much waiting for him outside his own 4 walls. David's life, if he was honest with himself, had become small. Work during the week. Grocery store on Saturdays. The same few channels at night. Friends who used to call more, before life and distance thinned things out the way it does. He wasn't unhappy exactly. He was just unfilled, like a room with the lights left off, even though the bulbs still worked fine. By Sunday afternoon, the key had become something he couldn't ignore. He decided to take it to the only place in town that might know what to do with an old, unmarked key like this. Hadley's, a small hardware and lock shop that had been on Main Street longer than David had been alive. The bell above the door rang as he stepped inside. It smelled like machine oil and cedar shavings. An older man behind the counter glanced up from a crossword puzzle, nodded once, and went back to it, the way small-town shopkeepers do when they trust you'll ask for help if you need it. David approached the counter and set the key down. "Found this in my garage," he said. "No idea what it belongs to. Wondering if you might recognize the cut." The old man, Walt, according to the embroidered patch on his shirt, picked it up, turned it over with the practiced hands of someone who'd been around keys his whole life. "This ain't a house key," Walt said. "Too thin, too short." He held it up to the light. "This here's an old safety deposit box key. The kind banks used before everything went digital. See this number stamped near the base?" David leaned in. There, faint but legible, was a small engraved number, 114. "Banks used to give out keys like this with a box number," Walt continued. "Whatever bank issued this, they'd have a matching number in their old records. Long as the bank's still around." "Any idea which bank?" Walt squinted at the design near the key's head. A small emblem, worn down but still visible if you looked closely enough. "That right there," he said, tapping it with one finger. "That's the old First Trust emblem. They got bought out by Heritage Bank back in the 90s, but the building's still standing. Corner of Birch and Main." David felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the particular electricity of a mystery suddenly having a shape. "Thanks, Walt," he said, slipping the key back in his pocket. "Curious thing," Walt called after him as David reached the door. "Whoever hid that key sure didn't want it found by accident. You don't put something like that in a toolbox unless you mean for the right person to find it, eventually." David paused at the door, the bell still faintly ringing above him. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's what's bothering me too." Heritage Bank on Birch and Main was a building that had clearly tried to modernize without fully letting go of its past. New glass doors bolted onto an old brick frame, fluorescent lighting buzzing over 100-year-old wood floors. David explained his situation to the woman at the front desk, who looked at him like he'd just asked her to solve a riddle from a fairy tale. She disappeared into the back for almost 15 minutes before returning with an older gentleman in a gray cardigan who introduced himself as the branch manager. "We don't usually keep physical safety deposit records past a certain point," the manager said, looking at the key with mild suspicion. "But box number 114, that's old enough it might still be in our archive system. Mind if I ask how you came across this?" "It was hidden in my garage," David said, "with my name on it." The manager's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that David noticed. "Your name?" the manager repeated. "What's your full name, sir?" "David Reyes." The manager was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that makes a person feel like they've stepped into something bigger than they expected. "Give me a few minutes," he said. When he returned, he was holding a thin folder, and his expression had softened into something almost careful, almost protective. Box 114 was opened under the name Eleanor Reyes, the manager said. "Closed account, far as her digital records show, going back almost 20 years. But there's a note attached, an old paper note, the kind we used to keep before computers took over everything. It says the box contents are to be released only to a person presenting this key and proving the surname Reyes." David's mouth went dry. "Eleanor Reyes," he repeated. I don't know anyone by that name." The manager studied him for a moment, like he was deciding how much to say. "I can't tell you anything more than what's on this form, son. But if you've got the key and you've got the name, the box is yours to open. Whatever's inside it, that's between you and whatever she left." David sat in his car in the bank parking lot for a long time afterward, the small manila envelope from the box resting unopened on the passenger seat. His hands hovered over it twice before he finally let them rest in his lap instead. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Not until he understood who Eleanor Reyes was, and why she had hidden something in his garage with his name on it, like she had been waiting, maybe for years, for him to come looking. The rain started that evening, the kind of soft, steady rain that turned a quiet town even quieter. David sat at his kitchen table with the envelope in front of him, a mug of tea going cold beside it, and for a long while he simply looked at it without moving. When he finally opened it, there were 3 things inside. A photograph, old and slightly curled at the edges, a folded letter, and a smaller key, brass like the first, with a tag that read, "For when you're ready to ask." The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of a small house. Not his house, but one that looked vaguely familiar, the kind of familiar that lives somewhere in the back of childhood memory. She had dark hair pulled back, a soft smile, and her arm was wrapped around a boy who couldn't have been older than 6. David stared at the boy's face for a long moment. It was him. He didn't remember the photo being taken. He didn't remember the woman at all. But there was something about the curve of her smile, something in the shape of her eyes, that tugged at a part of his memory he hadn't visited in decades. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the letter. "David, if you're reading this, it means you found the key, and that means more to me than you'll ever know. I wasn't sure you ever would. I wasn't even sure this garage would still be standing by the time you went looking, but some part of me believed you'd come home eventually. People usually do, even when they don't realize that's what they're doing. My name is Eleanor. I was your mother's sister, your aunt. I know that probably sounds strange, since as far as you've likely been told, you don't have an aunt. That was never quite true. There was a falling out in our family long before you were old enough to understand it, the kind of quiet, stubborn silence that families sometimes choose instead of forgiveness. I lost touch with your mother for years because of it. By the time I tried to come back, she was already gone, and you were grown, and I didn't know how to walk into a stranger's life and say, 'I'm your family. I'm sorry I wasn't here.' So instead, I waited. I bought this house years ago, the one that became yours after everything happened with the estate, hoping that someday, somehow, you'd end up living in it. I didn't know if you ever would. But I left this key anyway, because hope is a strange, stubborn thing too. If you want to know more, there's a second key in this envelope. It opens a small house at the edge of Miller's Creek, the lake town 2 hours north of you. I'm still there. I'm still waiting if you want to come. If you don't, that's all right too. You don't owe a stranger anything, even one who shares your blood. But if you do come, bring the photograph. I'd like to see it again after all these years. Eleanor." David read the letter 3 times before he set it down. The room felt very quiet. The rain ticked softly against the kitchen window, and somewhere outside, a car passed slowly, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling before disappearing again. He thought about his mother, gone for almost 15 years now, a woman who had rarely spoken about her own family, who had always changed the subject whenever David asked about aunts, uncles, grandparents. He had always assumed there simply wasn't much family left to talk about. He hadn't known there was someone still out there, someone who remembered him as a child, someone who had been waiting quietly, patiently, for a door that might never open. He picked the second key up off the table, turning it slowly in his fingers, feeling the same strange weight he'd felt the day before in the garage, the weight of a question that wouldn't let him go. Miller's Creek was the kind of small lake town that looked like it belonged in a different decade. Narrow streets, leaning street lamps, a diner with a hand-painted sign that hadn't been updated since the 70s. The lake itself sat gray and still under the overcast sky, fog drifting low across its surface like it was breathing. David parked outside a small house near the edge of the water, the address matching the one written on the back of the photograph. It was modest, pale blue paint peeling slightly at the corners, a porch with 2 wooden chairs, a wind chime hanging quiet and motionless in the still air. He sat in his car for almost 10 minutes before he found the courage to step out. He knocked twice, his heart beat louder than it had any right to be for something as small as a knock on a door. When the door opened, the woman standing there looked exactly like an older version of the photograph. The same eyes, the same soft features, though time had added lines around them that spoke of years he knew nothing about. She looked at him for a long moment, like she was afraid that if she blinked, he might disappear. "David," she said softly. It wasn't a question. Eleanor? She nodded, her hand pressed lightly to her chest, like she was steadying something inside herself. I really didn't think you'd come. I almost didn't, David admitted quietly. There was a pause between them. Not awkward exactly, just full, the way silence gets when two people are carrying more emotion than words can hold yet. Would you like to come in? Eleanor asked finally. I have coffee. Or tea, if you'd rather. Coffee's fine, David said. The inside of the house was warm, lined with old photographs on every wall. Some of people David didn't recognize, others of landscapes, lake views, quiet mornings. He noticed, near the fireplace, a small frame holding a photo nearly identical to the one he'd found in the envelope. Except this one showed Eleanor much younger, standing beside a woman who looked remarkably like the pictures David had seen of his own mother. That's her, Eleanor said softly, noticing where his eyes had landed. Your mother. We were close once. Before everything. What happened? David asked. Between you two? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, pouring coffee into two mugs with hands that trembled slightly. It's a long story, she said, and not a particularly flattering one for either of us. About time, David said. So she told him. She told him about growing up with his mother, two sisters close enough in age to be mistaken for twins by people who didn't know better. She told him about a disagreement over their own mother's care decades ago, when their parents had grown old and sick and the responsibility had fallen unevenly onto Eleanor's shoulders, while his mother had moved away, started her own life, started a family of her own. I said some things I shouldn't have, Eleanor admitted. Out of exhaustion, mostly. Out of feeling forgotten. And your mother said some things back that she probably didn't mean either. But once words like that are said, it's hard to find your way back from them. Years went by, then more years. And eventually it felt too late to even try. And then she died, David said quietly. Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. I found out 3 months after the funeral. I wasn't invited. I don't think she would have wanted me there, even then. She paused, looking down at her coffee. I thought about reaching out to you so many times. But how do you walk into a grieving young man's life and say, I'm your aunt, even though I let your mother and I become strangers? It felt selfish, like I'd be asking you to comfort me for a mistake I made. So you bought a house instead, David said slowly, understanding settling in. And waited. I told myself if you ever found it, really found it, not because I forced it on you, but because you went looking, then maybe that meant you were ready to know. And if you never did, then maybe that was all right too. I didn't want to interrupt your life. I just want to leave a door open, in case you ever wanted to walk through it. David looked down at his coffee, feeling something complicated settle in his chest. Not quite sadness, not quite comfort, but something suspended carefully between both. I don't really have anyone, he admitted quietly. Not in the way that matters. Friends, sure. But family. It's just been me for a long time. I know that feeling, Eleanor said. Better than you might think. David stayed longer than he intended that first visit. They talked through the afternoon, through a second pot of coffee, through stories about his mother that he had never heard before. Small things, the kind only family remembers. The way she used to hum old songs while cooking. The stubborn way she held grudges, but the soft way she apologized when she finally let them go. By the time he left, the fog over the lake had thickened into early evening, and Eleanor stood on the porch watching him go, her hand raised in a small wave. Will you come back? She asked, her voice carrying the particular vulnerability of someone who had spent years bracing for disappointment. David paused at his car door, looking back at her. This woman who was a stranger and family all at once, who had waited quietly for a knock that might never come. Yeah, he said, I think I will. And he did. He came back the following weekend and the weekend after that. Slowly, the visits stopped feeling like obligations and started feeling like something else entirely, something closer to belonging. Eleanor showed him old photo albums, told him stories about a mother he thought he'd already fully known, filled in gaps in his history that he hadn't even realized were missing. One evening, several weeks later, sitting on the porch as the lake turned gold under a setting sun, Eleanor turned to him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Something nervous, something hopeful. I have something else to tell you, she said. Something I should have said the first day you came. David waited. The house you live in, Eleanor said slowly. The one with the garage. I didn't just buy it hoping you'd end up there someday. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. I made sure of it. When your mother passed and the estate went into probate, there were arrangements made quietly that guided things in a particular direction. I have a friend who worked in real estate back then. Between the two of us, we made certain that house came up for sale right when you were looking at a price you could actually afford in a neighborhood close enough that I could still drive by sometimes just to see the lights on. David sat in stunned silence for a long moment. You're saying you orchestrated me buying that house? I'm saying I gave fate a little push, Eleanor said softly. I know that might feel strange, manipulative even, but I didn't know how else to stay close to the only family I had left without forcing my way into your life uninvited. David thought about it for a long moment. The years of feeling alone in that house, not knowing that somewhere, quietly, someone had been watching over him in their own complicated, imperfect way. I'm not angry, he said finally. I think I'm actually grateful. I just wish I'd known sooner. I spent a lot of nights in that house feeling like there was nobody out there who cared whether I came home or not. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. I cared, she said quietly. I always cared. I just didn't know how to say it without breaking something that already felt so fragile. David reached over and took her hand, the way you might reach for someone you've known your whole life, even though in truth, he had only known her for a matter of weeks. You didn't break anything, he said. You just took the long way to fixing it. Winter came early that year, dusting Miller's Creek with a thin layer of frost that turned the lake's edges white and brittle. David found himself making the 2-hour drive more often than he ever expected to, until eventually it stopped feeling like a drive at all and started feeling like something closer to coming home. One cold evening in December, sitting by Eleanor's fireplace with mugs of hot cider between them, she handed him a small wrapped box. It's not much, she said, but I thought it was time you had it. Inside was an old pocket watch, slightly tarnished, the kind of object that had clearly been carried by someone for many years. It was your grandfather's, Eleanor explained. Our father's. I kept it after he passed, never quite knowing what to do with it. It felt wrong to keep it forever, locked away with no one to pass it to. David turned the watch over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, not just physically, but the weight of history, of a family line he was only just beginning to understand. Thank you, he said quietly, for all of it. The key, the house, this. I don't think I would have found any of it on my own. You would have, Eleanor said softly. Eventually, some doors take longer to open than others, but they open all the same, as long as somebody's patient enough to leave the key. David looked at her for a long moment, feeling something settle inside him that had been unsettled for longer than he could easily explain, not just since the divorce, not just since his mother's passing, but maybe since some quieter, older loneliness he hadn't fully named until now. I used to think I didn't have anyone left, he said. Now I'm not so sure that was ever true. Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that carried both old sadness and new hope in equal measure. You were never alone, she said. You just hadn't found your way back to the people who were waiting for you. Outside, snow had begun falling softly over the lake, blanketing the dark water in quiet white, and inside, by the warmth of the fire, two people who had once been strangers and were now, slowly, becoming family, sat together in comfortable silence, finally home. Months later, David would tell people the story differently, depending on who was asking. To his co-workers, it was simply, I found some old family stuff while cleaning the garage. To his sister, it became a much longer conversation, full of questions and tears, and eventual gratitude that someone had finally found their way back to family they didn't know they'd lost. But to himself, quietly, on nights when the house felt a little less empty than it used to, he thought of it as something simpler. A key, a name, a door that had been waiting patiently for someone willing to ask what was on the other side. Sometimes the things we think we've lost were never really gone. Sometimes they're just waiting in a garage behind some old paint cans for the day we're finally ready to come looking.